Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. This is not a collection of humanoid accounts. This is, in fact, one person's story. I call this episode My Mother, the Mantis, the true extraterrestrial contacts of Sandra. I'm not going to use her last name. She wants to remain anonymous. Sandra reached out to me after finding out about my research, seeing some of my stuff on YouTube, and boy, does she have a story to share. I've certainly interviewed a lot of people, and much of what she describes is familiar to me, but some of her story is absolutely unique, and it's truly fascinating. She's had a lifetime of contact, not only with mantis-type extraterrestrials, but with greys as well, and also some really high strangeness events with the paranormal and psychic abilities. It's a truly amazing story. I did present it in my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness, so I'm going to be doing a little bit of a reading from that chapter. You might look at it that way. But I think you'll find this a particularly fascinating account because it is quite unusual and quite lengthy and extensive as well. And the first section I call Strange from the Start. As I'm sure you know, contact almost always begins for contactees at a very young age. Anywhere from a few months old all the way up to 5, 6, or 7, somewhere thereabout. With Sandra, it was quite early, and her first indications of unusual events were some very, very interesting psychic abilities that she presented at a very, very young age. Strange events surrounded Sandra almost from the day she was born. The year was 1940. Sandra was only a few weeks old. Sandra's crib was next to her mother's bed, so her mother could keep a close eye on her. And one morning, Sandra's mother woke up to an incredible sight. Sandra was levitating above her crib. Her mother immediately jumped up and shouted, "Whoever is doing this, put her down now." At that point, Sandra promptly floated gently back down into her crib, but this was an incident that Sandra's mother kept secret almost until the day she died. It was to be the first of many strange events that would become a regular feature in Sandra's life. At this time, Sandra's family resided in Long Beach, California. Her father was a captain in the Navy and held other prominent jobs within government, and as a result, his job would take him all over the world. Now, one of Sandra's first memories dates back to when she was only 9 months old. This may sound incredible, but a lot of contactees have very early memories and often report eidetic memories. Now, Sandra and her mother were riding on a public bus when another passenger began to argue with Sandra's mother. Sandra became angry and shouted at the other passenger, saying, "She's my mother and she can do whatever she wants." This was the first of many times that Sandra would amaze her family with her early childhood recall, because she was able to remember this as an adult. Really shocked her family. At age 3, Sandra vividly remembered the birth of her younger brother. All her aunts were there to celebrate the birth, and Sandra was disappointed because she was no longer the baby of the family. So a little miffed about this, Sandra decided to step outside. She looked up into the sky. This was a bright sunny day and wished it would snow. There were clouds. But to her shock, it actually started snowing. Now, this is Long Beach, mind you, Southern California. It rarely snows there. She was absolutely amazed. She ran back inside to share this miraculous event, but nobody cared. They were all busy with the new baby. So Sandra stepped back outside and enjoyed the snow alone. And after playing for a while, she became bored and decided to test her ability to control the weather by calling forth the wind. And she shouted out, "I want wind!" And to her delight, she says, powerful gusts of wind swirled around her. Now, had she actually called forth the snow and the wind? As an adult, Sandra's not completely sure. Nevertheless, it was an incident that left a very vivid impression on her mind, and future events with what we would call superhuman abilities certainly would make her wonder about this in hindsight. How interesting is that? I've certainly heard of other contactees levitating. It's not that unusual. I did a whole episode about it, so that really didn't surprise me too much. But Sandra's description of being able to control the weather, that is unusual, and I've only heard that a couple of times. But I have to believe it because this is something that turns up with a lot of contactee stories. I'm telling you, we all have these abilities. Some people just display them more often than others. I think their abilities are woken up somehow. I sometimes think it's partly due to contact. Partly sometimes I think these abilities actually are attractive to the extraterrestrials. They really are drawn to people with strong psychic abilities. And it didn't stop there. This was just the beginning, because Sandra soon began to display even more amazing abilities. So I call this next section Mystical Abilities. And man, oh man, the things she describes are just so amazing. Shortly after this, in 1943, Sandra's father moved the family to Norfolk, Virginia. 3 years later, in 1946, Sandra's sister was born. Sadly, she suffered from muscular dystrophy, but was otherwise healthy. Not long after this, Sandra's father, who was now working as an attaché to a Navy Admiral, announced that they were all going to go to Tsingtao, China, and actually live there in the former Swiss embassy building. Now, to 6-year-old Sandra, this was all part of a fantastic adventure. But she soon learned some harsh realities of what life was like outside of the United States. While her residence was nice, outside the embassy building, things were a little different. There was a large brick wall surrounding the building, and all the day's trash would be disposed of by their ama, who tossed it over the wall. Now Sandra became curious about life outside the building, so she peered over the wall, and to her sadness saw that there were children starving, waiting for the trash. They would actually pick through the garbage looking for food. And more often than not, equally hungry adults snatched the food scraps away from the children and ate it themselves. So this was a real wake-up call for Sandra. Sandra's family also had another scare when their ama secretly tried to broker a deal and actually sell Sandra as a servant, or worse. Thankfully, this did not happen, but it was a very powerful reminder to all of them that they were in a foreign country and had to guard their safety carefully. The only opportunity Sandra had to leave the building was to attend the international school in a convent where classes were taught by nuns. And this also led to some interesting situations, because the nuns began to show a very unusual and powerful interest in Sandra. At this point, Sandra wasn't sure why, but she soon found out. Before long, these nuns actually began to beg Sandra's mother to let her join the convent. Sandra's mother said it was up to her daughter. Sandra, however, had no interest in becoming a nun. Instead, she had aspirations of becoming a doctor. But one day, very soon after all of this, Sandra found out one of the reasons why the nuns showed such a special interest in her. The nuns would regularly place fresh-cut flowers throughout the convent, and of course, they would always wilt away fairly quickly. However, in Sandra's room, the fresh-cut flowers never seemed to wilt or droop. Instead, they remained as fresh as the day they were cut. But when Sandra was absent, these flowers would soon die. And as Sandra says, that surprised them all. And that was one of the reasons they wanted me to join the convent. That's part of it. I know how that sounds, but I have other cases like that. No, yeah, that was just part of it. Apparently Sandra was also displaying other mystical abilities that truly amazed the nuns. Forbidden from traveling outside, Sandra nevertheless longed to see the city, and she found that if she lay down, relaxed, she could actually leave her body, fly around, and explore the city at her leisure using what she now knows as astral projection. So that was interesting. Another thing that the nuns were apparently impressed by was Sandra displayed an incredible ability to care for the other children. She seemed to know things well beyond her years. Now, Sandra didn't talk about why, but she did have a secret, because it was during this time that she said she began to hear a voice in her head, a soothing female voice which would teach her and show her all kinds of things. As Sandra says, she would tell me all about my body. I learned a lot just by listening and looking at my body. This voice kept telling me about my body. I could almost see my body, the bones in my body. She would show me and tell me what was in the human body. So Sandra's interest in health and biology and being a doctor was being fortified by this apparent spirit guide. Now, at the time, Sandra didn't realize how unusual all these experiences were. Instead, she just found it very fascinating. But it was short-lived because her time in China was about to come to an end. After living there for about a year, in the beginning of 1947, they were told that they had to immediately vacate the premises. They only had 24 hours warning. Turned out war was brewing in the country and it was no longer safe for them to be there. How unusual is that? I mean, Sandra's just a tiny little thing and she's already displaying all these amazing abilities with healing and out-of-body experiences and so much more. So they fled China and ended up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is 1947 now. As you may know, this is when the Roswell incident occurred. I think it's quite possible, and so does Sandra think, that her father may have had some participation in the Roswell incident. She never was able to find out. But yeah, it was the summer of 1947, and this is when she had a truly incredible encounter, full-on onboard encounter, where she met praying mantis ETs, gray-type ETs, who apparently took her on board because they had some very important messages for her, apparently to share with all humanity. It's an incredible story and one of the most unusual ET contact stories I've ever heard. I call this one My Mother the Mantis. So now they are back in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, the summer of 1947. This is the exact time of the Roswell UFO incident. A really remarkable synchronicity there, considering that Sandra was about to have the most amazing encounter. Sandra had just turned 8 years old. She found herself once again having to adjust to a new home, a new neighborhood, a new school. But because Sandra had done so well in China and impressed the nuns with her extensive knowledge, her parents had her academically tested. And the teacher said she could skip 2 grades if her parents wanted. Her parents said no, so she instead just skipped the 2nd grade and put her in 3rd. Now their home at this time was located in a fairly remote location outside of Albuquerque. Luckily, Sandra had a new friend at a nearby Navajo reservation, only about 1 mile down the road, and one morning after getting permission from her mother, Sandra grabbed her bicycle and began the 1-mile trip to visit her friend. Sandra had made this trip several times before, and today seemed no different. As usual, the highway was pretty much devoid of traffic, so she just pedaled her bike along the highway. Then, as Sandra says, all of a sudden, it felt like there was a cloud over me. It got dark. So I stopped my bike and I looked up, and there was a gray, something was gray. It was round, like a sphere. So she could see this metallic object. It was silent, and in a matter of seconds, it landed on the highway in front of her. It was big enough to reach from one side of the road to the other, actually overlapping onto the shoulders. Sandra says, I knew what metal was, and it was gray, and it landed right in front of me. It was not small, but it wasn't that big either. I looked over, and there was a door. So Sandra, having been on a Navy ship, knew what craft looked like. She knew this was some kind of a craft, and she looked at it in absolute amazement. She could see the metal glinting in the sunlight. It was obvious to her that this was not normal. She peered into the open doorway and slowly, cautiously crept forward. After just a few short moments, she saw a tall figure appear in the doorway. As Sandra says, She looked like a praying mantis. I saw her face, and I saw her hands. She had long fingers. She was very skinny. She looked like a praying mantis. She was very tall. Sandra was absolutely startled by the being's strange appearance, and yet at the same time she felt no fear. She walked forward, and this mantis being immediately began to speak telepathically to her in a soothing female voice. And the mantis told her, "Come in." Sandra hesitated for just a moment, but the mantis seemed very friendly, welcoming, and nurturing, and she repeated, "Please, come in. Don't worry. Everything is fine. I'm your mother. So everything is fine. Don't be afraid. I'm your mother." So that, as you can imagine, fascinated Sandra, and feeling no fear, she walked up to the mantis, who took her by the hand and led her inside this craft. Says Sandra, "So there I was. I walked in. When I got in there, it seemed bigger than it did on the outside. She walked me around, and there were all these other little ones. They gathered around me. They let me walk around the ship. So I was walking around, and then I realized they weren't kids. They were these gray creatures. There were about 6 of them. I was fully accepted, and I accepted all of them. It was nice. They were very nice. I was just fascinated by what I had walked into. To me, this was all an adventure." So Sandra thought these were little kids at first, but realized, these are not quite normal little kids. In hindsight, she realized that they were what we would call grays, and she was delighted by them. They were very playful, very curious. They clustered around her, making soft, high-pitched, chirping noises, and as Sandra says, they followed me everywhere. They were everywhere with me. They were just showing me that they were friendly. They wanted to touch me. I had blonde hair, and they wanted to touch my hair, and that sort of thing. They loved my blonde hair. And I was like, okay, because I had gotten used to that in China. In China, everybody was wanting to touch my hair, so it was not a problem. So Sandra, absolutely amazed, roamed through the ship in a state of complete awe. She said the inside was very bright, very clean and sparse. There were gray metal walls. She said the grays acted like little children, while the mantis mother led her gently through the craft. Says Sandra, "She looked like an ant, but a different size of an ant. A praying mantis. I mean seriously, a creature, an insect that was talking to me. That was something else. I thought, oh my, that is strange. But it was all very pleasant. To me, it did not feel like anything to be afraid of. I was so amazed. I really did like them. I had no problems with them. They were all friendly." Now Sandra had only been on board this craft for only a minute or two when something caught her interest. As Sandra explains, "I saw a porthole, just like I had seen on the ship from China. So I said, let me look through the porthole. And what did I see? I saw Earth, and I saw the moon. It was in between, the moon and the Earth. And I was thinking, wow, this is fantastic. And the moon looked pretty big, like we were closer to the moon than the Earth. And I thought, oh God, this is interesting. I looked and I thought, where am I? I was so amazed to be out in space. I enjoyed the ride. I was looking at the stars, and it was just amazing. It was just fascinating, looking at the Earth from so far away. I was thinking, wow, this is great." So Sandra was utterly captivated by this amazing view. She had felt no movement or inertia, so to find herself suddenly so far away from Earth so quickly was a huge surprise. Says Sandra, "We were out in space, which was fascinating to me. I just can't tell you. It was like, wow. Then I kept walking around, and finally, kind of like in the center of the ship, everyone was gathered around. It looked like a box, like a TV. Now, I didn't know what a TV was at the time, but that's what it looked like. I don't know how to describe this, but it was like a hologram." So as Sandra focused in on this, she saw movement and colors. She first saw darkness and clouds, and then suddenly it all became clear. She couldn't believe what she was looking at. She saw people in uniforms, marching. She saw tanks. She saw guns and explosions. These were all images of war. It was quite small, about a foot wide, but very colorful, vivid, and totally lifelike. As Sandra says, I thought, wow, what is this all about? And I heard from her, my mother, the praying mantis. What you are seeing are pictures of future wars. You need to let people know. This is what is going to happen if mankind doesn't do something. This is going to be the future. So as you can imagine, once again, Sandra found herself absolutely astonished. Says Sandra, I don't know exactly what she said because I was so fascinated with everything. But she was trying to tell me that we had to watch out. Otherwise, there would be many, many wars. That's all she would say. And I thought, well, I'm out in the desert. How am I going to tell anybody? What am I supposed to do with this? So she was struggling with all of that when, as Sandra says, the next thing I knew, I was in my bathroom. Now, rewinding just a little bit, unknown to Sandra, her family became alarmed when Sandra failed to show up at her friend's house on the Navajo reservation. So they immediately began a search. They could not find her. And in fact, Sandra was missing for about 7 hours. They simply could not find her anywhere. They went up and down the highway several times, finally decided to check it again, and there they found Sandra sitting next to her bike alongside the highway. She was in a daze. She did not seem to be aware of her surroundings. They thought at first that perhaps she had crashed, but that made no sense because an earlier search had failed to locate her. And furthermore, Sandra didn't have a scratch on her, nor did the bike itself show any signs of damage. Sandra doesn't really remember this. Her first conscious memory after seeing these holographic images of war on board the craft and being warned about them was waking up in the bathroom of her home. So she exited the bathroom and was immediately confronted by her mother, who wanted to know what happened now that Sandra was lucid. She wanted to know, had anyone hurt her? What did Sandra remember? Did she need to go to the doctor? But Sandra insisted that she was fine. She said she didn't remember anything, because even at that age, she knew she would not have been believed. As Sandra says, that was the thing. I didn't think they would believe me. They would not have believed me. Isn't that interesting? Sandra's taken on board, meets this Mantis ET, who introduces herself as her mother. May sound strange, but I've heard that in other ET contact stories. Doesn't surprise me that Sandra kept quiet about it. Even at that age, she knew how unusual this experience was and that there probably wasn't much use in trying to tell people, though she eventually did try. She told people at school, was not believed, learned again the hard way to keep quiet. But her psychic abilities continued to manifest. She had some very powerful out-of-body experiences where she could see her whole neighborhood all over the place. She asked her grandmother if she had had experiences, and her grandmother actually admitted that yes, as a young girl, she also had encounters. This is an important detail. I go more into this in the book, but it's important because this is another indication that contact is generational. Certainly does seem to be true in Sandra's case. But Sandra grew up, she got married, had kids, she went to college, she became a teacher, got a degree in psychology, actually. So she's quite accomplished. And basically, that was her last experience with the mantids. However, it certainly was not her last experience with the Greys. She went many years without any encounters that she's aware of. But then one day, the Greys came back into her life, and again, they had some very interesting information to share with her. Now, as an adult, Sondra had left all of that behind. She thought that her experiences with ETs were over, but turns out they weren't. And for her it began when one day her husband made a startling admission. He told Sandra that shortly after they got married, he woke up to see two, quote, creatures standing at the foot of the bed. Equally startling was the fact that Sandra appeared to be talking to them. Now frightened, he told the creatures to leave and don't come back. Oddly, Sandra has no memory of this visit. As she says, "I do not remember anything. I don't remember that at all." But around 1990, it happened again, and this time Sandra did remember. Says Sandra, "I woke up and they were on the side of the bed. They came to me and were talking to me. I can't remember what they were talking to me about, but she certainly remembers what they looked like. She describes them as short little grays, very friendly and not at all threatening. Sandra has no memory of being taken on board, but again, neither could she remember what the ETs were telling her. At this time, Sandra was living in Virginia Beach in Virginia, and before long, the Greys started visiting her fairly regularly. Now, she never saw them arrive, but she would be wakened in her room by this noise, and there they would be. It seemed like they were often bumbling around the room, chirping and knocking into things, being kind of playful, and on a few occasions they seemed to be producing, she says, some kind of music. They were always interested in talking to Sandra, but when morning came, Sandra could never quite remember what they had been talking about. She almost never saw them arrive or leave, but sometimes they would stay for so long that Sandra had to actually tell them to go away and that she needed to get her sleep. But as Sandra says, they made a lot of noise, and I would have to say, please, stop, knock it off, no noise, no noise. Sandra was particularly concerned about her husband because she had tried telling him about what was happening and her experiences during childhood, but it was clear that the subject made him uncomfortable and that he did not want to talk about it. But still the Greys kept coming. As Sandra says, they were little gray creatures. They seemed to be really happy with me. They always woke me up, like 2, 3, or 4 of them, like, let's have a party. And I would wake up and say, would you please not make so much noise? I have to go to work. You have to stop making so much noise. But they were happy to be in my house. It was almost like they were dancing, and there was some music that came along with it. That's what woke me up. The music and talking. So sometimes the Greys would wake her up and Sandra would just lay in bed and ignore them and wait for them to go away. It became such a regular thing that it was a normal feature of her life, and she just didn't pay too much attention to it. Now, a few times she did become curious if other people in the world were having similar experiences, so she decided to pick up a few books on the subject. But she quickly put them down because she was disappointed to hear strange and lurid stories of abductions and examinations and fear-filled encounters, which wasn't her experience at all. She wondered if the cases she was reading about were even true, so she no longer bothered to even read them. She did notice some patterns. The visitations would come in waves, sometimes frequently, though sometimes it would be quiet for several months. But they always seemed to return. On a few rare occasions, she did see them arrive. She would wake up to see the room filling with light, and then the Greys would be there. Also, equally rare was seeing them leave. But it did happen. When they left, they would float up through the closed window and into a bright light, which would quickly wink out. One time, they showed up and she did actually remember what they told her. Says Sandra, they said, I am going to live a long life. That's what they basically told me. And I thought, well, that's nice. It's like they're there to take care of me for some reason. Of course, this turned out to be true. Sandra has lived a very long life, and quite healthy too. Other strange things happened. Sandra was working. She had to commute about 45 minutes to her place of employment, and sometimes, inexplicably, she'd find herself arriving 30 minutes early. It happened enough times that she knew it wasn't her imagination, and yet it was weird because she never saw anything strange during these trips. She couldn't explain how it was happening. Suddenly, she'd just find herself pulling into the parking lot at work. As Sandra says, that happened quite a few times. I was taken care of. Very interesting stuff. Sandra's not only having sometimes missing time, but apparently added time. Other contactees have described that to me, arriving at their locations far earlier than they should have. So there's some really interesting details to some of these contact stories that you don't often hear. Now, Sandra's husband wasn't super receptive to the fact that she was having contact, even though he himself had seen the Greys. So it was kind of a part of her life that she just kept mostly quiet about. But this is definitely a pattern we see with a lot of contactees. They live, as Jacobs says, David Jacobs, secret lives, or two separate lives. I hear this sort of thing all the time. Finally, she did summon up the courage to ask her sons, she has 3 sons, if any of them had encounters. None of them did. All of them were a bit surprised to hear their mother's accounts of having encounters, but were very supportive. Sandra never did get a chance to ask her siblings. She had a sister and a brother, but she never was able to ask them. They passed away before she had a chance to ask them, and that's when she finally decided she better ask her children. Unfortunately, they did not have anything to add, so she was kind of left alone with this. Possibly they do have encounters but don't remember, but there's no real indication of that. At any rate, Sandra spent most of her life without having a whole lot of encounters, though many years later, as often happens, the Greys returned again. This time they had a message and a warning, and that's what I call this segment, a message and a warning. So time marched on, and while the visitations continued, they slowly slowed down and eventually seemed to completely stop. Sandra would occasionally dream about the ETs, but she was almost never visited, and if she was, she didn't remember it. But every now and then it would happen. One of the last occasions occurred around 2018, and it was apparently an important visit, because as Sandra says, I was awakened with 2 of them sitting by me, wanting to chat or take care of me some way. And then I finally got the message. You need to go to the mountains. And I got this feeling that there was a war coming on. As a result of this, Sandra and her husband eventually sold their house in Virginia Beach and moved up into the mountains. And it wasn't long after that that the 2020 pandemic hit, and then the political unrest, war in Europe, something which still concerns Sandra. And as recently as 2022, she heard some strange noises at night but was unable to identify them. She can't conclusively say that it's the ETs, but she knows that they're still out there. She has the sense that they are still watching over and protecting her, but she's glad she got that message. She's now safe in her mountain home in case anything should happen. I think you'll agree Sandra's story is pretty interesting, very compelling. She has witnesses to support her case, and the fact that she went missing as a young child and nobody could find her, that's quite significant. Where was she? Well, she was on board a craft. Her husband also saw the Greys. So my point is, this is not simply one person's eyewitness anecdotal testimony. She has corroborating witnesses. That I think is important because it always adds a level of credibility to the case. Sandra is certainly not seeking fame. She insisted upon anonymity. She had to be convinced to be interviewed, as many contactees do. They're very wary of being disbelieved, ridiculed, being gaslit because they had an experience that they don't fully understand. But I think a lot of people are having these experiences. I think it's important we all know about this because I think we now have enough people coming forward to say for sure that these events are happening. I like Sandra's story because, like most of the people I interview, she doesn't feel like the ETs are here to hurt or take over or cause fear or anything like this. Again, she did try to read some other people's accounts and just finally put the books down because they were very lurid, very fear-based, and that just wasn't what she was experiencing. So I really want to thank Sandra for coming forward. I know it takes a lot of courage. Her story is an important one, and certainly I think adds to our knowledge of what's going on here with extraterrestrial contact. So that's it for today. If you want to learn more about Sandra's story, please do check out my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness, 20 True UFO Encounters. It's got much more information than I was able to present here, and a lot of other really interesting contact stories, complete with all the high strangeness that is involved with UFO contact. So yeah, thanks again, guys. Truly appreciate you guys tuning in. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the answers, and most important of all, keep having fun. I think it's why we're here. Bye for now. See you next Friday.